Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Matt back here with another video. Today we're talking about 6 landscape photography tips for beginner landscape photographers. Whether you've been doing photography for a while and haven't done landscape, or you're just absolutely new to it, this video is for you. The reason I'm doing this is because I asked about this on my community tab and someone seemed interested. And this is something I wanted to do anyway because I don't want to always be doing reviews. It's not really that creatively fulfilling. I want to show more examples of my work beyond just testing a lens. So without wasting any more of your time, let's just get right into it with the first tip. So tip number 1, this is going to seem really obvious to some people, but I bring it up for a reason. You want to shoot with a deep depth of field. You want to be shooting at f5.6, f8, the sharpest areas on your lenses, maybe even f11. If you're shooting on an APS-C system like me, I'm shooting on Fujifilm X-T3s for the most part. Try not to go past f11 because if you stop down your aperture to f16, yes, you will get a very deep depth of field, but you'll run into an optical issue called diffraction. Whenever you stop down your lens too much, the light kind of bounces around and softens your image. So you want to be shooting at like f8, f11, maybe f5.6 or f4 if you don't have a ton of light, but there will be some remedies for that. I'll give you some tips for that as well. But yeah, shooting with a deep depth of field. The reason I bring this up is because for the most part, YouTubers hail f1.2, f1.4 lenses because they get really creamy bokeh, but largely that's for portraiture. There are examples of landscapes where you will have a shallow depth of field. I'm giving you tips, more generalizations rather than like hard and fast rules. So there will be counter examples as to what I'm saying here. But for the most part, shoot with a deep depth of field. The YouTubers that are talking about f1.2 lenses, f1.4 lenses, they're talking about really portrait lenses and not landscape lenses. You can use basically any lens for landscape because almost any lens that's sold currently is going to be sharp around f8. That is the sharpest point of almost any lens. Tip number 2 is to use a tripod. So this is going to seem really cumbersome to those photographers out there who are used to just carrying their camera around like I always usually do and just banging out shots and moving on and not having to spend too much time on each individual frame. There's a reason behind using a tripod. It's like all these things I'm kind of telling you are like philosophies or just ways to go about landscape. But when you use a tripod, you generally slow down a little bit. You think more about your composition and you usually get more keepers out of like the photos you take. You might get less photos overall, but more of them will be keepers because you're thinking about each composition a little bit more. And composition is what really drives landscape photography and makes it interesting and makes a great landscape photo versus like a picture of a random picture of a mountain, you know? Another reason to use the tripod is to use slower shutter speeds, which will again help you get a deeper depth of field. Maybe I should do a video on the exposure triangle if I'm going to be making stuff geared toward beginner photographers, but generally, when you want a deep depth of field, you have to stop down your lens and it's going to cut out some light, so you have to like slow down your shutter speed. But at a point when you're trying to hand hold a camera at too slow of a shutter speed, you're going to get motion blur in your picture. So a tripod will remedy that, and you can do exposures that are 30 seconds, a minute long, and not have to worry about getting any camera shake. So being able to have a slower shutter speed is nice to stop down your lens, but I'll also get into the next tip here, which is filters. Being able to shoot at a slower shutter speed can help you get different kinds of compositions and pretty interesting images. So say if you use an ND filter, which is there are like 2 main filters I would really recommend for landscape photography. There are people who go really into it and buy all these crazy filters, but I think there are 2 filters that will really help improve your images. You don't have to buy these filters, especially if you just want to try out landscape photography, but if you're going to really try to be serious about it, there's 2 filters I'd recommend, and that is a circular polarizing filter and a variable ND filter. Because we were just talking about slowing down your shutter speed, I'm going to talk about the ND filter first, which an ND filter, a variable ND filter, is a filter that you twist and it darkens down. It just goes in front of your lens and it basically acts like a pair of sunglasses, and it just cuts out some light. Now, why would you want that? Usually you want the most light in your image, but you might want to do that to draw out and get a picture like this of like water. Sometimes you have to do long exposures, but sometimes you do it as a stylistic choice with an ND filter and you darken down, especially if you're shooting waterfalls and stuff. And instead of getting like a really harsh image of water frozen in time, you get a nice creamy image of water. The other filter I was talking about, circular polarizing filters, they can be good for cutting reflections off. So say usually when you're shooting landscapes, you don't want to be shooting at high noon or whenever the sun is really harsh, but sometimes that's when you go out and that just happens to be when you're shooting, or sometimes there's still harsh reflections even whenever there's good light. because of what you're shooting, say it's like a reflective leaf or whatever, you can cut down on these reflections. It's kind of like magic with a circular polarizing filter where you just twist the filter and reflections on glass, reflections on shiny leaves, on water, they'll just go away so you can kind of see what's under that reflection, and this helps you get really vivid colors, and sometimes it even like darkens down the sky. It has a weird thing, it sounds like I'm making this up, but if you're like 90 degrees perpendicular to the sun or something like that and use a circular polarizer, like it won't work. It like has to be from different angles from the sun. I don't fully understand all of that, but I know as a general rule, using a circular polarizer will cut down on reflections. You get more vivid colors in your landscapes, and you can also darken down the skies and even out that exposure, because you'll often run into situations where it's a really pretty situation, but there's too much dynamic range for your camera to handle. That means like the sky's too bright and the landscape's too dark. So you can use a circular polarizer, kind of darken down the sky and average out that exposure a little bit. There's also other crazy filters that has like a dark gradient. It starts dark and gets gradually lighter as it gets down to your landscape. You can invest in that, but I haven't personally invested in that, so I won't really vouch for that. And I think a more simple route is just to get the filters that screw onto the front of your lens and aren't giant panes of glass. All right, tip number 4. This is more of a compositional tip, and that's just to keep your landscapes simple. I'm going to show you some examples here of landscape photos that are pretty, but I think don't work compositionally because there's just too much going on. YouTubers will say, like, for landscapes, the wider the lens, the better. And it's not necessarily true, because there is such thing as getting just too much in your image. There's not anything that your eye is drawn to. You should always really have a subject when you're taking an image, and that's a huge compositional thing that I didn't really figure out for a while. I was taking pictures and I was wondering why they weren't interesting. It's because they weren't really pictures of anything. There was no main compositional element. Another general rule that's not a hard and fast rule, kind of like I've been saying, but just a generalization, is that you should have 4 or less visual elements in your photograph to make it more compositionally striking. And I have a lot of examples here where I have just a few compositional elements. The photograph is simple, and that's kind of what makes it. And I think a lot of photography is boiled down to just simplicity and the idea of conveying that idea. But I do have exceptions to this rule of photographs that have so much going on, and I still think they work compositionally. So I don't know. Photography, the art of photography can't be boiled down to shoot 4 or less elements in your image, but these are just general things to maybe help you as a beginner. Another thing with composition, I'll just throw this in here, is try not to leave a lot of blank space in a part of your image. Try to look at it in 4 quadrants and think of it as there's something going on that's different in each one of these, because I have some images that are really pretty overall, but then there's just like a blank sky for like a quarter of the image, and it kind of ruins it, and I can't quite crop it in just because of how I composed it. So think about that as well when you're composing your landscapes. Tip number 5 is to shoot multiple focal lengths. I was just talking about not always shooting the widest lens possible. Sometimes that is what you want, because there is just, you have such a grand scene in front of you, and there's not like a lot of confusing elements, but you just want to capture it all for one perspective. Sometimes that is what you need, but sometimes people have been doing landscapes with telephoto lenses. Sometimes there's things really far away that would make a really good composition, but you just can't get to there. So there are cases for using telephoto lenses for landscapes, ultra wides, just kind of wides, 50mm standard lenses, and everything in between. And it all depends on just what perspective you want. Sometimes you want to compress things in your photo. You want to take the different image elements you have. Say you have like the foreground, which is like some grass in the front, and the middle ground, which is like the mountain or whatever, and then the sky, and you want to kind of compress those together and make them feel like they're one. You'd use more of a telephoto lens. But if you want to kind of separate and make them feel like they're far apart, you use more of a wide angle lens. So I could do a whole video on why I use different lenses for this. I've done this for like just in general, like portraits and stuff, but yeah, using different lenses can really help you get more of an interesting body of work if you're shooting landscapes and not just shooting ultra wide all the time, you know? I would recommend, if you're a beginner to landscapes, you probably have your camera and a kit lens. So shoot with your kit lens, shoot at the wide end of it, shoot with it zoomed in, and just start experimenting with it. And whenever you edit your photos, pay attention to what you really like the most. And then maybe if you're gonna buy your first prime, buy it in that focal length if you wanna focus on landscapes. And I already touched on this earlier, but the 6th tip is to always have a subject in your photograph, like not just some random mountain and all this stuff going on, and there's like a house over here and like a cloud up here, but the sky's blank. It's like, have like a main visual point. A person should look at your photograph and immediately their eyes should go to what your subject is in the photograph. And if there's nothing that your viewer's eye is going to immediately, I would say that your photograph doesn't have a subject or doesn't have a strong enough subject. So I already mentioned this earlier, but I think it's a really important point that I hope that the photos I show you of mine that I consider that work, I've showed you some that I don't think work and some that I do work, but I hope for all the photos I show you that I think work, that there is an immediate subject that your eye is drawn to, and you see what I mean when I talk about that. That's all I have for this video. I hope I've shown you lots of examples, and I hope I could help out some beginners or even somebody who's been, just trying to do landscapes on their own, and maybe they haven't seeked out any tips or anything. So hopefully I could help somebody out there. Hopefully this video had some educational value. I really try. I'm not like an expert landscape photographer, but I've been doing it and I have some photos I'm pretty happy with. So I thought I would pass on that knowledge. I think that's what photography is all about, instead of figuring out what works and hoarding that so nobody else can grow. So leave a like if you enjoyed this video, leave a comment down below. Let me know if you want to see any more stuff on landscape photography. I'm trying to learn as much as I can about macro photography right now, because I think that could be a really interesting video, and I've just been kind of experimenting with that and kind of falling in love with that. So that's another kind of photography. Maybe a year from now, whenever I learn a lot more about it, I can talk about. So I'm done rambling for this video. This was a nice video for me to just talk and talk and talk, but I hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in the next one, guys. Bye.